My family owns a small cottage on the outskirts of a small town in North Carolina. This old log cabin is a sort of family heirloom that we are all reluctant to get rid of, as it is where our family originated from. But there is another reason we have not sold it, and that is that there is a very interesting story attached to this place, one that may be very interesting to the neutral observer, but must have been quite frightening to my grandmother, who was the one who actually lived through this experience. This was in the summer of 1988, a year before I was born, and at that time my grandmother was alone in the cabin. My grandfather passed away before I was born, but almost every summer they were together. My grandparents would go to that cabin and spend 2 weeks completely alone, cut off from civilization, with nothing but squirrels for company. But after Grandpa passed away, she decided to keep this tradition and kept going to the as a way of dealing with grief. And that's how in the month of June '88, she came to that place alone for the first time. In the old house I had no television, but I did have an old radio with which I listened to a now defunct station, which was Grandpa's favorite. The station, like most of its kind, used to take short breaks for news broadcasts, and one day, my grandmother heard the news of a series of terrorist bombings which had been going on in Georgia and Alabama, and which left in their wake a lot of wounded. The police already had a suspect they wanted to talk to, but the man was on the run before they could catch him, and there was a suspicion that he was hiding in the hills of his home state, which was none other than North Carolina. The man they were talking about on the news was someone very dangerous, and the reporter who was giving the report gave a brief description of the suspect. This was a man of average height with dark hair and light eyes. His name was Klaus Belmont. My grandmother used to tell us that the name stuck with her from the first time she heard it on the radio, mainly because of the Christmas song about Santa Claus, and at that time, she found herself whistling the song around the house, even though it was believed to be bad luck to sing it in the middle of summer. A few hours passed, and between the country songs of the season and a program of romantic stories that was one of her favorites of the season, Grandma had forgotten a bit about the news story. The sun began to set over the horizon, and as she was relaxing, reading a book, leaning back on the old couch, which, by the way, is still in the cabin, she heard someone start knocking on the door. This was quite strange to her, as she wasn't expecting anyone, and the only neighbors she had were about a mile away. So, with understandable trepidation, she got up and walked to the front door of the cabin, and when she opened it, she found a man of medium height, with light eyes, dark mustache, and a striking cowboy hat. Being the kind soul that my grandmother was, she greeted him with good night and asked how she could help him. "Good evening, ma'am," the guy began. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you a small favor." He then asks my grandmother if she has any food he can give her, and told her he also owned a cabin in the area and had come to visit her property only because he got off after work and forgot to pick up food for his cabin, and that was how he had ended up without food for the night. As Grandma tells it, it was clear that the guy was very shrewd. He was being polite and nice to her to gain her trust, and she instinctively invited him in, without thinking too hard about it, of course. Grandma usually kept her pantry stocked with all kinds of dried and canned goods, so she always had some shade, so she filled this guy's backpack with dried food and fruit, but at one point she raised her face and looked at him, and that's when she stops and asks him his name. Grandma says that he told her his name was Claire. Then she asked him for his last name, and for some inexplicable reason, instead of making up a last name, he told her his real name, Belmond. That last name immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. She wasn't entirely sure, but it was enough to make her feel a bad feeling in the pit of her stomach. And considering this was long before cell phones existed, and the cabin didn't even have a landline phone connection, the most effective form of outside communication was yelling. And even then, it was pretty hard for anyone to hear a mile away. My grandmother says that at that moment fear began to invade her, and as she evaluated her options, she realized that the only thing she had to defend herself was an old flare gun. And if her situation was as bad as she thought, a flare gun was not going to be enough to deal with that stranger. So instead she decided to play along. Grandma shrewdly decided to play along. She knew that if she played dumb, gave the boy some food, and let him pass, he might not get aggressive, and if she was lucky enough to survive that night, she could drive into town first thing in the morning and tell the cops that the man they were looking for had stopped by the cabin. But then, just as she was about to politely ask him to be on his way, he said something that changed everything and made every hair on her body stand on end. "Actually, I have another small favor to ask of you. Do you have a place in this cabin where I can rest and spend the night?" I remember when she got to this part of the story, my grandmother always said that there was a moment of tense silence where she looked the man face to face and she could see a mixture of desperation and evil in his eyes. She tried with all her might to remain calm as she said, "I'm sorry, I just don't have room to spare." Then Claire reached into her jacket and pulled out a gun, pointed it at him and said, "I'm so sorry. I was hoping you wouldn't say that." She then nodded towards the gun and said, "Don't make me use this. And in case there are still any clueless people out there who haven't noticed, the man at her door was not Claire Belmond, or whatever fake name she made up at the time. This man was Klaus Belmond himself, the terrorist who had caused a lot of deaths. Grandma said that was by far the scariest moment of her entire life, but not for the reasons you might imagine. As she said, she was never afraid of dying at his hands. She was about 70 years old at the time and thought she had settled things with God a long time ago. But what was really scary was how strangely normal this guy was, even after he took off his mask and showed her his true face. He remained polite and cordial to my grandmother, and even offered to help her with housework and stuff in the morning. Obviously, she told him she was more than capable of taking care of herself, and she definitely didn't want the FBI to think she was okay with him staying there overnight. But still, he was nothing like the unhinged maniac she had imagined him to be after hearing the news report. My grandmother used to say that the only time he ever really gave a hint of who he was or what he had done was when they said grace before dinner. She could never remember exactly what it was he said, but it was something like, "In the end, the righteous will prevail." This was a man who had literally murdered hundreds of people and attempted to murder hundreds more in a series of horrific bombings, so she simply could not process the fact that he referred to himself as righteous. This frightened her as few things in the world had until that night. Grandma said she felt like she was in front of a flesh and blood demon, and just the thought of sharing a table with him made her stomach simply shut down, so it's not surprising that she barely touched her food. After dinner, she went to bed in her room, while Klaus took the old couch. While she was in the room, Grandma couldn't sleep a wink. In a way, she expected that at any moment he would burst in there and simply end her life. But as I told you before, this was not something she feared. However, that was not what happened. Instead, when it was close to midnight, she began to hear a rotor-like sound, and suddenly the cabin was completely illuminated. An intense bright white light hovered over the whole place. Then he realized that it was a helicopter. At that moment, he thought it was only a matter of moments before a group of FBI agents burst into his cabin, but he did not want to leave the room. She waited for a few moments while the helicopter's engine continued to sound loudly overhead, but no one entered the house. On the contrary, at one point, the helicopter simply began to fly away. She said she must have fallen asleep at the end, because the next time she woke up, the cabin was fully illuminated, but this time not by the lights of a helicopter, but by the rays of the sun. Then she got up and wandered all over the house, but found no trace of Klaus. It was as if it had all been part of a dream, as if he had never really been there. But then she finds a note on the countertop, handwritten, that said, "Thank you for your hospitality. God bless you." Then there was no doubt in his mind that it was all real, and that the helicopter he had seen in the night had actually come for him. My grandmother used to say that if it had been a young person, he might have really hurt her, but she was an old woman, so she posed no real threat to him. Plus, she knew well that the little cabin had no phone line or anything with which she could report an intruder to anyone. However, Grandma always emphasized that what was really scary about this experience was not that he could hurt her, because somehow her instinct told her he wouldn't, but she always emphasized that this man was completely normal and very polite, that there was no difference between him and any person we could consider harmless and decent. And that is probably one of the most important lessons my grandmother left us through this experience. Sometimes the real monsters are not horrible beings that exude evil at first sight. It may be so in some cases, but sometimes the most evil and nefarious monsters hide behind a harmless face and a kind and polite behavior. So we should not trust a person only for what they appear to be. My name is Robert, and the story I am about to tell you happened when I was 15 years old. At that time, I lived in the middle of nowhere, in a small town with a population of less than 300 inhabitants. Before this, I used to live in an apartment in the middle of the city with my mother, where I spent most of my life. However, due to financial problems, I ended up moving to this small town on the outskirts of the city, to a house that was owned by my mother's boyfriend at the time. This was the first time for me living in a place like this, and I must say, I hated everything about it. The property we moved to was located between a church, a cemetery, and an old abandoned school. You can imagine how happy I was with this. Of all these places, each more creepy than the other, the abandoned school was the closest building we had. It was only about 20 to 30 meters away from the house. Now I can tell you that I have a whole arsenal of terrifying stories about this place. So many. I could probably write a whole book with them. From children's laughter in the middle of the night coming from there, to having constant episodes of sleep paralysis that I never experienced until I lived in that place. But the story I am about to tell you is centered on something much more terrifying. In this town there was no internet, which was a complete nightmare for me, as I came from living in a big city. And before moving, I spent most of my free time watching videos on YouTube and playing online games, as I have never been too sociable. However, once we were settled in that little town in the middle of nowhere and completely away from technology, I had no choice but to entertain myself with the few games I still had installed on my PC, or just watching the same 10 movies I had on DVD over and over again. The night of the incident, it was around 3 a.m. Everyone else was in bed by then, but I had stayed awake, tucked into my computer playing an old Hitman game that I had installed before we moved in. While I was playing, I had my headphones on the whole time so I couldn't hear any external sounds, but at some point, I paused the game, and that's when I thought I heard a sound like rustling leaves coming from the yard near my window. I took off my headphones and walked to my window, leaned out and looked down but saw nothing. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, and below that was the kitchen, which was also connected to the door leading to the back porch. After I heard the rustling of leaves outside, there was an eerie silence. I must say I was already nervous, but soon that silence was interrupted by the frantic barking of our dogs outside, which echoed throughout our house. Hearing this, I ran for the stairs and started down the steps to go find my mother and stepfather, who had their room in the basement, which meant I had to go through the kitchen to get to them. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, near the kitchen, I started hearing banging and yelling to my right, which was where the door to the back porch was, and where the dogs were just barking. At that moment, I froze. I was completely paralyzed, firstly because of fear, and secondly because I didn't want to move and let whoever was there see me. But fortunately for me, my mother and her boyfriend also heard all the commotion, and the latter met me on the stairs at the same time the horrible banging and screaming had started. My mother's boyfriend came to the back door and asked the guy what he wanted, and that's when things started to get weird. Looking through the small window in the overhead door, my stepfather noticed that the stranger on the back porch was soaked in blood. I swear this was one of the creepiest things I have ever seen in my life. That man was covered in blood from head to toe. However, he didn't appear to be hurt, just very desperate. When my stepfather asked the man what had happened to him and what he wanted, he began to blurt out that he was being chased through the woods, that there was a group of people trying to kill him, that they shot and wounded him. At that point, the guy started begging us to let him in so he could hide and use our phone. My stepfather had told him to move away from the door and show him where he was shot, but upon doing so, the man quickly changed his story. Now he started to say that it was not his blood but his partner's, something he had not mentioned at any point. But then he started to ramble on, and at this point my stepfather asked him to leave, and I wished the door in his face. It was then that things took a very scary turn. Seeing the door closed, the man began frantically pounding on it and yelling to be let in. But as he did so, his tone changed from pleading to demanding, and from demanding to threatening and frighteningly violent. The guy started kicking the door and threatening to kill my stepfather. Meanwhile, he kept telling him over and over again to get out and warned him that he would call the police. In the midst of all this chaos, my heart was pounding so hard that it felt as if it would burst out of my chest at any moment, while my hands began to shake uncontrollably. My stepfather told me to pick up the house phone and call the police immediately. While I was on the phone with the police, I saw my mother run downstairs to her room and then come upstairs with my stepfather's gun and put it in his hands. The man at the door kept banging on it in an irrational way, while he kept shouting threats and at the same time saying that he was going to be killed by the men in the forest because of us. This was completely creepy and terrifying. That moment turned into an agonizing waiting game, as I was on the line with the police counting the minutes until they showed up, and during all this time the man was banging on the door and trying to get in at all costs, until at one point he started screaming in a heartbreaking way, as if he was very terrified and desperate, and started saying that the men were coming, that they were around our house with their guns, and that they were going to start shooting. By then, my stepfather had already turned off all the lights in the house so no one could see where we were and potentially shoot us, just in case he was telling the truth. And as everyone in the house was engulfed by panic, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, sirens began to be heard approaching. My stepfather made me look out the window facing the direction of the road so I could let them know when they got there. As I anxiously waited for the cops to arrive at the house, I couldn't help but look around, wondering if the guy was really lying. But at that moment, I could see the blue and red lights parking in front of our house. That's when I turned on the lights and started to get their attention through the window. We were all still in a state of panic and locked in the house when the police car's loudspeakers began to demand that the man come off the porch with his hands up and then get down on the ground. Fortunately, the guy listened and did not resist arrest, so soon the cops took him to the police station. I must say that after this incident, I couldn't go back to sleep for the rest of the night. In the end, it turned out that the man had originally tried to break into our basement where my mom and stepdad's room was, before he started banging on the back door. We also learned that this man lived near our house and was an addict who had had this type of psychotic break before. However, even so, none of this explains where the blood he had on him at the time came from, and what he intended to do if we had let him in. My name is William, but everyone calls me Will. I live in a farming town in Texas where the nearest city is about 20 minutes away by road. The experience I'm about to tell you about happened when I had just turned 18. Before all this happened, I happened to drive into town to have dinner at a new sushi restaurant that had just opened, but immediately became one of my favorite places. After that, I decided to go to my grandmother's house instead of continuing straight home. To give you some context, my grandmother lives in the same town, but on a farm with a large tract of land, and to get to her house you have to take a detour down a long dirt road for about half a mile. I got there around 9 p.m., walked into the house and greeted my grandmother and my brother who lives with her. I had been doing this frequently since my grandfather passed away this way. At least I could keep her company. My brother and I took my grandmother's dog out to pee around 10:30 p.m., and we sat outside listening to music and talking for a while. At that point, I started to get a little cold because, well, this was East Texas, so I wasn't used to the cold at night, but back then the weather was a little crazy and there was a period of very hot days and near freezing nights. The thing is, my brother and I decided to go inside, but as we were about to do so, I suddenly noticed out of the corner of my eye something moving near the big metal shed a few hundred yards from the house. At first I didn't really pay much attention to it because it's not uncommon for raccoons and deer to come sniffing around the yard, and besides, my grandmother's dog wasn't barking, so I thought it might have been my eyes playing tricks on me. We finally got back inside the house, and my grandmother went to sleep around 11 p.m., so my brother and I stayed up and played some video games for a while. By the time it was around 2:30 a.m., I was really tired and ready to go home, so I asked my brother to walk me to the door and make sure I got to my car, because I always get a little paranoid, especially at night. He joked about it but said he would do it. When I left the house, I turned off the light and closed the door. I was a little scared as usual, because the truth is that when I go driving alone and at night, I always get a fear. And honestly, I don't know exactly what causes me that feeling. I don't know if it's the fear of something bad happening, or the creatures that hide in the shadows, or it's just some kind of phobia of the night. The truth is, I don't know exactly. I just know it happens to me. But I'm getting sidetracked from the story. The truth is that I begged my brother to walk me to the car, to which he finally went along with me. I got in my car and immediately locked the doors, started backing up, and as I was facing the dusty road, I saw in the rearview mirror that the porch lights were going out. As I was driving back down the dirt road, I arrived home in about 10 minutes and made myself some ice cream before sitting down and starting to watch YouTube videos. Another 15 minutes or so passed when I got a FaceTime call from my brother, which I answered, obviously, and almost instantly I could tell he was freaking out about something, but he didn't say anything right away, so I asked him what was wrong. The following is my best attempt at paraphrasing what my brother told me. He basically said that after I left, he went back outside to listen to some music and sit on the porch. He had the music on his phone pretty loud, which usually masked any animal noises coming from the nearby woods. After a few minutes of listening to music, he said he heard what he thought had been a sound of metal being struck, so he quickly stopped the music and listened carefully to see if he could hear the sound again. He stood up and looked toward the tent in the boathouse that was a few hundred yards from where he was standing, then said he saw a faint light shining near the boathouse, but then it quickly went out. At that point, she started to get scared, so she quietly went back inside the house and closed the door behind her. She said she ran to her room in the back of the house, I guess, without thinking of waking our grandmother, and grabbed her revolver, quickly ran outside and saw the glow of the flashlight move, and then it quickly went out as soon as she noticed it. He walked to the edge of concrete carport and looked into the boathouse with this revolver at his side. The only thing illuminating the boathouse was the dim light coming from the house. He said he tried to muster the most intimidating voice he could and said, "Who the hell is out there?" To which there was no immediate response except for a slight knock, which corroborated the fact that someone was there. Keep in mind that this happened in the middle of the countryside, in a town with a population of just over 1,000 people, and the nearest houses across the lake are miles from the main road. So no well-meaning person would stumble upon my grandmother's house at this time of night. Also, my grandmother has had problems with people snooping around the property in the past, so this is not something any of us take lightly, and for the life of me, I can't tell you why my brother didn't call the police. But you should also remember that there is literally one cop in the entire town, not to mention that it was 3 a.m., so it would take at least 30 minutes for the cop to show up. Anyway, my brother called the person back to show himself, repeating this question over and over again. He confessed to me that he practically peed his pants when a lanky figure emerged from the boat shed with a flashlight in hand. Although my brother couldn't see any distinguishing features of the person, he could definitely tell it was an older man and that it was no one we knew, especially no one who should be in our boathouse at 3 a.m. He raised the revolver to point it at the man and shouted again, "Who the hell are you?" The man was still silent and began to walk slowly toward him. My brother removed the hammer from the revolver and gave the man a final verbal warning. "I swear I'll shoot you. Who are you and why are you here?" The man quickly threw up his hands and said, Hey, calm down, man." His voice sounded ominous as he continued walking towards my brother. In light of the stranger continuing to advance, my brother fired a single shot just above his head, which he finally took as a sign that my brother was serious. The guy quickly took off on foot down the driveway, and my brother yelled, "Next time I don't plan to miss," and then quickly ran inside to wake up my grandmother, who somehow managed to sleep through all the commotion. She didn't seem concerned enough to call the police, but of course, after hearing this, all I could think about was what were the man's true intentions. Was he just a drug addict snooping around to steal some tools or money? Or were his intentions much more sinister? Another question that haunts me about the whole situation is how many times has this happened after my grandmother and brother went to bed and we just didn't know about it? Was he watching us all night? Then I thought about what might have happened if my brother had turned off the lights and locked the doors behind me when I left. I grew up in a small town in the UK, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and no one keeps secrets for very long. When I was 13, I became friends with a girl who lived in a house just behind mine, and we started hanging out after school. We didn't do much when we weren't at each other's house, just visited the local park or walked down the street talking about school drama. My friend smoked cigarettes, but I didn't because we were underage and she would take them from her father, or just pick the used ones off the ground. Yes, this was kind of gross. On our street, we had a neighbor I will call Diana, a false name to protect her privacy. This woman was about 60 years old at the time and was known as the stereotypical crazy cat lady, as she lived alone with her pile of cats, and many people in town avoided dealing with her, as she was also very unhygienic and strange, always smelling of cat urine, even though her cats were well cared for, but I don't know why she smelled like that anyway. This woman used to hang around me and my friend. I will call my friend Megan, another fake name to protect her real identity. The thing is, I took the bus home from school and we had to pass by Diana's house to get to ours, as this was the fastest route. Whenever we passed in front of her house, Mrs. Diana would always stand at her garden gate and strike up a conversation with us. No matter how much we tried to dodge her, she would always find a way to keep us there, either by quoting something or asking a question, which annoyed me a bit because I just wanted to get home. However, this didn't seem to bother Megan as much as it did me, because she would always play along and stay to chat. Sometimes when we were wandering around, she would also try to talk to us. For me in particular, it was kind of suffocating at times. And then she found out that Megan smoked. I don't know if it was that she could smell the cigarette on her or not, but Megan admitted it when Diana asked her about it. That day, she told us to wait a second, then disappeared for a few minutes and came back with 2 cigarettes. She went to give me one, but I refused. Then she handed them to Megan and said, "More for you?" and then smiled at Megan. I felt very uncomfortable, but I didn't want to show it because I didn't want to make them uncomfortable or make them think the wrong way. Now, I'm not homophobic at all, but I knew Diana was a lesbian, or that was what was always said about her. And looking at the situation, her behavior towards us, I honestly wondered if she was up to something more sinister. This will make more sense as the story progresses, but for a woman her age to offer cigarettes to a girl to make her feel cool and special, clearly not someone with good intentions, that didn't bode well for me. Anyway, Megan accepted the cigarettes and continued to talk effusively with her. After that, Diana gave Megan cigarettes every day after school. I told my friend that I thought it was weird, but she disagreed, and that Diana was just cool because she was a hippie, and she told us that she smoked as a teenager too. I wasn't convinced at all, but I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want Megan to get in trouble with her parents. One weekend, it was late afternoon and we were walking through our neighborhood again. When we passed Diana's, she must have seen us from her living room window because she ran into the yard and then waved us over. I felt annoyed again because I hated being around her, but I had to follow Megan. She gave my friend another cigarette, only this time, she handed her a lighter and told her to smoke it standing in the doorway. I looked around, but there was no one outside, as it was winter and the sky was very cloudy. I thought Diana was being very forward by letting Megan smoke right in front of her, but I didn't want to leave my friend, so my feet stayed firmly rooted where they were. The woman asked us what we were going to do that day, and Megan just told her that we would probably go into town to go shopping and maybe go back to her house until dinner time. She nodded and then suddenly invited us over to her house for orange juice. I was really annoyed and really didn't want to go in, and I could tell Megan didn't either, and now we just looked at each other. Although Megan was too rebellious and stubborn to admit that I was right in my doubts, even she could tell something was wrong with this. So she just said, "No, thank you." She tried to keep her voice light, but I could tell she was as uncomfortable as I was. "Come on, I have fresh Tropicana, and this summer is unbearable. Come in and have a drink," she said. I felt very uncomfortable, so I spoke up and told her no. While I usually let Megan do the talking, This time I was quick to tell her that we had to go into town and that we didn't have much time left before our bus arrived, so we'd better get going right away. Then I grabbed Megan by the hand and basically dragged her away from there. After that, we didn't look back and walked in silence to the bus stop. While there, I told her that Diana was very creepy and that I didn't have a good feeling at all about her inviting us into her house. And fortunately, Megan agreed appreciatively, at least at first. Later that day, when we were in Megan's room after returning from a day of shopping, she told me that maybe Diana hadn't meant to be weird, or some hidden bad intention. At the time, I looked at her as if she was growing a horn on her forehead and two heads. She said that maybe since Diana talks to us a lot, she was just lonely and was seeing us as her friends. This really left me very puzzled. For Christ's sake, we were 13 and she was like 60. There is no way this is a normal friendship. I told my friend that I disagreed and that it was also very strange and irresponsible that she was giving her cigarettes, and now to top it off, she was inviting us over for orange juice. This was something I could not overlook. It was too strange, plus his attitude was too, and frankly, there was something about the whole situation that just felt wrong. It felt uncomfortable. I told Megan that there were a million reasons why we shouldn't go into a stranger's house to have any drinks. She could spike our drinks and kidnap us, among anything else she could do. When I told her this, Megan, rebel as always, wanted to contradict me and told me that I was just being paranoid, and that she thought I was being very unfair with my judgments of Diana. She said something about not knowing if I was being overprotective or prejudiced and gave me a whole speech about how I couldn't be the kind of person who judges others just for their tastes or how they look. But my concern had nothing to do with that, but rather with her attitude, which was already starting to make me quite uncomfortable. But unfortunately, my friend was not able to see that, or she just didn't want to lose the supply of free cigarettes and wanted to justify her friendship with Diana. However, as it usually happens, time always proves her right here in the Has, and this would happen just a few weeks later. Before that, we told a friend who was a few years older about the whole situation with Diana. She echoed Megan's sentiments and said that Diana was probably just lonely and was simply trying to be nice to us. This made me angry, because I truly could not understand how they did not see the strangeness in this situation and how potentially dangerous it could be for us, especially Megan, who seemed to be Diana's main object of interest. However, I didn't want to push it any further and just let it go, and never talked about it again with this friend. Now, the incident that finally caused the concrete veil that everyone had in front of their eyes to fall off took place in early to mid-November, around 5 p.m. My curfew was from 7 to 8 p.m., as was Megan's, as we were both the same age, and our parents imposed more or less the same rules on us. By this time it was about 4 p.m., but it was already dark, which is normal during this time of year in the UK. Our neighborhood had these moss-covered steps that if you walked up them, it was a shortcut to Olivia Street. And if you walked down, you came to my street. People used to sit on the steps, and the steps had these bushes that covered the sides completely, so even though someone's house was on the left side of the bushes, it still felt isolated. Anyway, we were sitting there playing music and playing with sticks, when suddenly Diana appeared in front of us and came up the stairs in our direction. Megan and I moved to make a space in the middle so she could pass between us. She was walking her dog, which was a golden Labrador. We patted him and waved as she passed. He didn't move, which was unusual, but we didn't pay much attention. About half an hour passed and we were still sitting there just talking, when I told Megan that I felt like we were being watched. Megan said it was just the darkness that made me feel that way, but I disagreed. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. It was something I could just feel, and I was sure it was. I don't know how much time passed, but suddenly we heard a shuffling noise. This startled us, and we both turned around in horror. It was then that we saw a purple mass emerging from the bushes on the side behind us, which was heading straight for Olivia Street. It was Diana. She had been wearing a purple jacket, and her gray hair also gave her away. The dog was no longer with her, and it occurred to me that she must have walked in that direction to go home and then come back. But instead of going up the stairs again, she walked up my street to the top of the stairs so we wouldn't see her for sure. Well, Megan and I were the only people there at the time, and all this time she was there spying on us. I hope I can explain this in a way that makes sense. Both Megan and I saw her. And then Megan yelled, "Run!" We did. We ran down the steps along the street up the hill to my house. We were so scared and out of breath, but luckily there was no sign of Diana. When we stopped and looked down the road, I told Megan that Diana was a creepy person and had only snuck out to spy on us, but this wasn't the worst of it, for I had felt the exact same feeling of being watched on other occasions. When we left school, when we sat in the park, even when we were at her house. This was a worry that had haunted me for days, something I had already told Megan about, and she simply dismissed it by saying she was paranoid and had feelings against poor Diana. That day, we promised not to tell anyone about it, because we were too afraid that our parents would go to Diana's store and confront her about it. Plus, we would probably have to tell her about the cigarettes and all these things we did without permission. And while I wasn't the one sneaking cigarettes, I didn't want Megan to get in trouble either. After this incident, we started taking a different route home from school and avoided her house like the plague. We didn't see her again for a few weeks, and when we finally did, she ignored us. However, after a while, Megan and I finally stopped being friends because we were very different people, and she became very toxic as she got older and was not good company for me. Every time I look back, I really think Diana was up to something bad with us. It's very inappropriate for an adult to give cigarettes to a child and invite them over without parental permission. I don't know what she was planning while spying on us that night or what would have happened if we hadn't noticed. However, I am very glad to have come out of that situation unscathed, and also to have ended my friendship with Megan. I grew up in a small town in Nebraska, and in the almost 18 years I lived there, only two major things happened. The first, and probably the best thing, is that, well, I was born. Not that I'm a big deal, but to me it was important. And the second, and perhaps the worst thing that happened in our town, was when Chris Baldwin set himself on fire in the garage of his house, or rather, maybe what Chris did, constituted to never happening the worst thing that could have happened in our town. This may not make sense to you right now, but when you hear the story I'm about to tell you, you'll understand it all. It was a Sunday night, and I was in my freshman year of high school. At that time, I was still at that age where my friends and I would go out biking at night. You know, good healthy fun, getting some exercise on top of it. That night we were riding along when all of a sudden we see another kid in our class driving down the street at full speed. But when we saw where he was going, we all gasped in unison and said, "Oh my God, Chris's garage is on fire." Seeing this, we all sped down the street with our bikes until we arrived at this burning inferno, which used to be the garage of our partner Chris Baldwin's house. When we got there, I already saw a police and fire department on the scene. They arrived almost in split seconds. We tried to get closer, but an officer immediately told us to stay away. We thought we were already at a safe distance, so we were very confused. However, we did exactly as we were told. Only then did we start hearing all these bangs and bangs coming from the garage, while firefighters were desperately trying to put out the flames. Suddenly there were several pops, and we all ran for cover. We had no idea what was causing them, but we were really very scared. For a moment I thought the Baldwin house was about to explode or something, and when we realized this, we all ran for cover. The next morning after the fire, everyone at school was talking about it and waiting for Chris to ask him what had happened, but he didn't show up for any of the classes. Rumors began to spread among the kids that paramedics had been seen at the scene of the fire, who were loading someone into the ambulance, so we presumed that maybe Chris had been injured in the fire. However, other witnesses claimed that Chris was not actually taken out of the house injured, but his body completely scorched. On the other hand, some claimed that he had simply gone with his parents to live with relatives because his house was left in ashes. There were many rumors that began to emerge, but the truth would come later. The next morning after the incident, the authorities finally reported the event. 3 generations lived in that house, and Chris was one of the 4 children of the family, but nothing was known exactly, only speculation. Logically, many more rumors began to circulate, and it wasn't until the next day when the principal of our high school called us all together for a special assembly, and it was there that we really got some concrete answers. I remember the whole school walked into the gymnasium where the county sheriff and a handful of deputies were standing, each of them with a very serious look on their faces. Once we were all seated, the principal opened up saying that the county sheriff had something important to talk to us about, and as he stepped forward and took off his hat, I swear to you what we could have heard a pin drop. We knew it was going to be something about the Baldwin family, but not exactly what it was. I could have sworn I never would have guessed in a million years. I'm not going to pretend I can remember what the guy said word for word, since this all happened over 20 years ago, but it was basically this. Folks, you've all heard about the fire at the Baldwin house, and I'm sure you've all heard about the tragic loss of life. Today, I'm sorry to have to be the one to tell you, but Chris, your classmate, was the one who passed away. At that moment, a sort of collective gasp was heard through the gym, and the sheriff paused for a second before continuing. Now we're still trying to figure out how the fire started, so we invite anyone with information about Chris to step forward. You don't need to do so now. You can call my office anytime and we can have a more discreet conversation, but please, if anyone has anything to say, or remembers any strange or unusual behavior that Chris exhibited in the days leading up to the fire, I implore you to step forward. That was the first clue we had that something was really wrong. I guess they wanted to handle the whole thing discreetly, and then we understood perfectly well what the reason was. Everyone's initial reaction was one of total shock and grief. The children were horrified that one of their own had died in such a horrible way. But if the policeman had told us what had really caused this terrible tragedy, I don't think people would have been so sad, rather angry, and even relieved that it had happened. It took several more days for the truth to come out, and by that time the town had decided to shift the responsibility to our parents. I remember there was a town meeting, that due to my parents asking me to do my homework before returning, and all I did was play video games for about 2 hours. When they got home, I thought they would be mad, because I hadn't even made a dent in any of the stuff. But they weren't mad. Rather, they had these weird but sad looks on their faces, exactly the same ones they had when my grandfather died suddenly. They sat me down in the TV room and asked me how well I knew Chris. I didn't tell them much, that I had Spanish classes with him, but that we never spoke. Then they started asking me a bunch of other questions. If Chris ever got mad at me, if I liked him, things like that. In the end, I simply told them that it was obvious that they knew something about Chris, and I would rather they just told me at once. I thought it was about her committing suicide. If so, at that time I was old enough to handle the truth, or so I thought. But it turns out I was wrong, because the truth about Chris's death was something that would definitely take me years to digest. Actually, Chris did not commit suicide but lost his life accidentally. His garage exploded when Chris was trying to make a bomb. Yes, that's how scary it sounds. He was making a test model to build a bomb with which he planned to blow the school to pieces. When I heard that, I was completely shocked. More than that, I was terrified and in shock. It turns out that after doing a lot of research and investigations about what caused the fire in the garage, they realized that there were all the elements needed to make a bomb similar to the one used by Arab terrorists. However, it was not until they found Chris's diary that they realized what his macabre plan was, since the boy had written down in detail everything he planned to do, when and how. When this information was made public, the whole town was completely shocked. This was something that no one expected, and that revealed a level of evil that no one had been able to see in Chris. Through his diary, it was also known that his goal was to kill some kids he hated deeply. However, it was not too clear if he had been a victim of bullying by these people, because that was never exposed in the writings of his diary. Basically, there he talked about the hatred he had for his classmates, the school, and his fantasies of blowing things up. So it was never known if he was seeking revenge for something they did to him, or he was just an evil person and that's it. But without a doubt, this is the scariest incident I have ever witnessed. I moved my family into a beautiful house that my father bought at auction for a very good price. Our new home was located in a small town that was only about 10 minutes from the largest city in the state, and it was actually better than any of the houses we had lived in before. This one had a large pool in the back and a small garden next to it. There was also a large tree in the backyard, which was filled with fragrant yellow flowers every spring. One of the main reasons why my parents decided on this house, besides the good price, is because it was also very close to the school, and it had a reputation of being a very safe place to live. So they were happy with this, since security is very important to my family and for a good reason. Last year, a couple of criminals broke into our old house in the middle of the night. These tied us up and gagged us, and besides terrorizing us with death threats, they stole much of our belongings and some money that my father had in the safe. This was obviously a traumatic experience, and the main reason why my parents decided to look for a different place to live. In addition, my parents also traveled a lot for work, so there were many occasions when I had to stay alone in the house. But since the incident I told you about, we had very strict security rules at home, one of them being that my dad had security cameras and alarms placed all around the new house, and there was no way anyone could enter undetected. At the back of the house, there was an old 3-story apartment. I always saw people on the first and second floors, but the third floor felt like no one stayed there. The third floor bedroom windows looked directly into the back of our house. This new neighborhood was a calm and quiet place, so I liked to relax in my house while my parents were on tour. One weekend, my parents had to travel to Los Angeles for a seminar, and I stayed home as usual. It was a Saturday night and all my new friends wanted to hang out at another classmate's house. I promised my parents not to stay out late, so after a couple of beers I came home as I had promised to do, even though I was having a great time. It was 9 p.m. and I wasn't sleepy at all, so I went upstairs and put on my bathing suit to go swimming in the pool. It was a hot summer night and it was perfect for a swim. I went down to the pool, poured myself a glass of freshly made orange juice and put on some music. I swam for a while, and then drank my juice lying on the pool raft. I must have fallen asleep at some point, and then I heard a noise and woke up. I looked around and saw no one. The back of the house was empty. There was no one around. At that moment, my eyes went to the third-floor window of the building. There I saw a frail old woman standing in front of the window looking directly at me. Her eyes were so big that her gaze frightened me. I said nothing and looked at my watch. It was around 10 o'clock at night. I continued lying on my raft, and after a couple of minutes, when I looked over there again, she was not at the window. I was relieved and kept thinking how come I had never seen her before. I almost thought no one lived in the third-floor apartment. That's when I heard my phone ring. It was inside the house. So I got up from the pool thinking it was my parents calling and was about to go inside when I heard a voice coming from behind me. I froze instantly. It was an old woman's voice. I slowly turned around and my heart choked in horror as I saw this creepy old woman standing right behind me. This really terrified and unsettled me, as I had no idea how she had gotten into my yard, as there was no way she could have gotten in undetected by the security system. Her cold death stare made my legs go numb. She was very close to me, so I literally could not move away even though I wanted to too badly. But instead I said in a halting voice, "Ma'am, how did you get in here?" I expected her to answer my question, but instead, something happened that made my blood run cold. She opened her toothless mouth slightly and said, "Annabelle, are you still here? Run away, Annabelle. Run away now, or your husband will come and bury you there." Then she raised her feeble hand and pointed toward the tree in our yard with her long, creepy fingers. A shiver ran through my whole body and I replied in an even shakier voice, "What? What is she saying?" She didn't answer, just continued to stare at the tree and then turned back to my face, and her mouth and eyes opened in an expression of horror. It was an absolutely horrible sight. And suddenly my phone rang again, and I ran away from frantically and didn't stop until I got to my room. Once I got inside, I locked the door. My heart was pounding as my phone continued to ring, so I reached over and picked it up and saw that it was my dad. I answered the phone, and without being able to articulate a word, I was left crying terribly. While on the other end of the line, my dad asked me over and over again what was wrong with me. It was only after a few seconds when I was able to tell my dad what happened. He got really scared and called 911. The cops arrived after 10 minutes, and I told them that a crazy old lady from the nearby apartment came into our backyard and said some very strange things to me. These immediately went to the apartment building and asked the landlord about his tenants on the 3rd floor. But I was in absolute shock when the landlord said that that floor of the apartment had been empty for the last 15 years. But he also said that an old lady used to live on that floor a long time ago. She was sick and bedridden, so she spent most of the day sitting near that window inside the house. She would not come out of that dark room, and her children left her alone during her last days of life. She even died sitting near that window. The owner himself did her cremation rituals, as no family member came to claim the poor old lady's body. The next morning, when my parents arrived, I told her everything that had happened, and also the police lady who had stayed with me at the house since the night before. She explained to my parents that I might have had a bad dream or something, but while they were talking, something came to my mind. I asked my dad what the name of the previous owner of our house was, and he responded by saying that the bank had told him that a woman lived here with her husband before us, but they moved out of town and missed payments from the bank, which is why the property had been confiscated and recently auctioned off. But he also pointed out that it was 15 years ago. My heart started pounding, and my look of terror must have been so evident that the policeman asked me what, if anything, happened to me. So I told him that the old lady addressed me as Annabelle and warned me that my husband would bury under the tree. They both seemed quite surprised, and the police even asked for permission to search our backyard. My father granted it, and the next day they started digging under the tree. To our horror, as soon as they started digging, the bones of a human being began to emerge, which seemed to have been buried there for many years, as they were completely white. We were all totally shocked, including the policemen themselves. The corpse had a ring on her left hand, and there were also some textile items at the site. The human remains were taken to the scientific headquarters of the local police and subjected to various tests, and a few days later, it became known that the remains belonged to a woman named Annabelle Dubroff, a 28-year-old woman who, together with her husband, was the former occupant of the house where my family and I now lived. It turns out that her husband had filed a missing persons report, but after filing the report, he too left the house and the city. Due to lack of evidence, the police could not find any details about her, nor did anyone come to the station to inquire about her whereabouts. But this must be because the woman was Ukrainian, had arrived in the country about 2 years ago, and had no Malia here. The autopsy report indicated that she had been murdered. The woman had been struck with a blunt object to the back of the head. The policeman instantly suspected that it was her husband who had murdered her and buried her under that tree. But to this day they are still searching for her husband. I'm almost certain that the old lady saw this whole incident from her bedroom window, but she couldn't tell anyone. Although people find it hard to believe, I think the old lady died feeling guilty about what happened. But I wondered why she had come to me, why not to my mom or dad? Because I was completely sure that it had been her ghost that I had seen that night. However, this doubt would be cleared up for me only a few days later, when the police made public the news of the macabre discovery, and a photograph of her was published in the local newspaper along with the whole story. This is something that still to this day has my parents and me very shocked, because this woman was identical to me. That is probably why the spirit of the old woman came to warn me. She thought I was Annabelle. We still live in the same house to this day, but I have never seen that old lady again. This story happened to me last year and was my encounter with one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in Texas state history, the famous Marfa Lights. It may not be as scary as some of the other stories presented here, but this was a unique experience for me and really very disturbing. For those of you who have no knowledge of the subject, I'll put it in context. Some nights, when looking across the West Texas desert outside the town of Marfa, strange red, white, or yellow orbs can be seen. These lights seem to hover above the desert floor and have, for decades, been the subject of all sorts of stories. You may see just one or two, or sometimes several in the air at once. Sometimes they float perfectly still before they begin to flicker or move, even shooting flashes across the night sky. Stories about this phenomenon are many and date back to the 1800s. There are even Native American legends about the mysterious lights, and many researchers have been conducted around this phenomenon. Studies have been conducted to try to determine its origin, but most have been unsuccessful, since it has not been possible to determine for sure what produces the phenomenon, or at least not in a scientific way. The main theory is that the unique atmospheric conditions in that region of Texas cause the headlights of automobiles to reflect in the sky. But many people do not believe this to be true, especially since the phenomenon has been sighted even when there has been no traffic. And as I said before, its sightings date back to times when there were not even vehicles with bright headlights in that area. Now, having said that, let's go with what happened to me. I was on a trip with some college friends out west. Our intention was simply to experience the beauty of the Chihuahuan desert culture, but once there we heard so many stories that we decided to visit the viewing area, which was about 10 miles outside the small town of Marfa. One of my great hobbies is bird watching, so when we embarked on the trip I brought my big telescope, which I now plan to use to see the lights better. We arrived about half an hour after sunset. If you have never been far out in the desert, I must tell you that it really gets dark out there. And I mean really dark, that is. The only source of light in that place were the dim lights on the steps of the observation area, the stars, and a single cell phone tower that could be seen in the distance. I set up my scope and we positioned it on the cell tower. We didn't have to wait long before a small white light appeared in the distance. It moved slowly along the horizon line before it began to flicker. Then another and another appeared. Sometimes they would go out after a minute. Other times they would be visible for about 5 or more minutes. But each time I focused my scope on one, I was never able to see any discernible feature other than a small flash of light. Another strange thing to note was that no matter how many times I turned the zoom, the lights never appeared larger than when we looked at them with the naked eye. I found this really strange and disturbing, as I couldn't come up with a logical explanation for it, but I didn't want to give it a second thought. We stayed about an hour at the site, and I was absolutely fascinated by the little lights that seemed to have a life of their own, but that wasn't the only time we would see them on that trip. A couple of days later, we were returning from a hike in Big Bend. It was a long drive back, as I recall. It was pretty dark when we got back to Marfa. Driving through the desert at night is surreal. You can go hundreds of miles and see almost nothing. It's like the whole world fades out of existence beyond the reach of the headlights. As we passed the observation deck, we saw about half a dozen white, red, and yellow lights in the desert, the most we had seen at one time. But when the whole thing got weird was when I turned around in my seat and saw a small reddish light behind us. It was just one, so I didn't think anything of it at all, and from my best angle I guess I could make sure it was about half a mile behind us, maybe 25 or 50 feet off the ground. I thought it might have been a motorcycle, but then it started moving perpendicular to the straight road we were on. That's when I started looking at it more closely. The little light followed us for about 10 minutes, and I could assure that it kept the same distance between us and it during the whole journey, before making a turn and suddenly disappearing in the air. We were all completely perplexed. We were somewhere between fascinated and intrigued, and yes, also a little scared. After all, it is a natural human instinct when faced with something you don't understand, or for which you have no answers, as in this case. None of us had ever seen anything like it, and 2 of the people in the car had been there several times. I personally have seen the lights many times, but never anything like it. We didn't feel threatened by it, but it was an unsettling experience that many people probably have never had in their lives. If any of you are in West Texas, be sure to stop by Marfa and see if you can catch a glimpse of these strange lights. People have speculated that these things may be ghosts, aliens, car lights, or even electricity caused by the rocks under the area. But I really hope the mystery of the Martha lights is never solved. We need a few more mysteries in the world, and this one is really fascinating. I went to college in a small town in northern Colorado. I moved there in the fall of 2008, and I moved there right after one of the worst crimes that has ever taken place in the area. This event shook the entire community from top to bottom, but the craziest part of it all is that I actually moved into a house just 2 doors down from where it all happened. I was living with my grandparents at the time, and they were really shocked. I can remember my grandfather sitting at his desk, standing guard until 2 or 3 in the morning every night with a glass of whiskey in one hand, and his old gun very close to the other. My grandfather is a Vietnam War veteran who takes security very seriously, so after that crime spree he simply reverted to his survival instincts. I was new in town when all the information was in full swing, so the whole community was in complete shock, and basically everything at that time revolved around what was going on, so it was a little hard to follow. I'll give you a preamble before I go on. In town there were 3 boys who ran together and were known to cause a lot of trouble in town, and when I say trouble, I mean criminal behavior. Their names were Danny, BJ, and Steve, who was the oldest of them all and was 18 years old at the time. To me, these names meant absolutely nothing, but to the townspeople they were well known and usually the first to be singled out for just about any of the basic crimes that occurred in the place. From what I gathered, it seemed that these 3 had been on a bit of a roll in the last few months, created a lot of destruction, but in reality these guys were nothing more than a trio of troubled teenagers who didn't get past doing some petty theft and some vandalism. However, they believed that they were really a dangerous criminal gang, so they needed to get out of town and outwit the law. This was all in their heads. Since they were teenagers, 15, 16, and 18, nothing they were doing was really that bad. Still, they convinced themselves that they were career criminals and were about to run away. So they started looking for the things they thought they would need for their escape, starting with cash. For this purpose, the boys began a series of nighttime robberies that led them to get a small pile of cash, but they also stole some valuables and a gun. Danny got the gun from a box he stole from an abandoned house and handed it to the group. From there, they felt they had hit it big. They could start robbing people for real. I think they were within the same 72 hours of stealing the gun when they broke into a house in the middle of the night with the intention of taking everything of value, but they didn't expect to find Bobby and his wife asleep in bed. This was something they were not prepared for, so they were trapped. But now they had a weapon, so they ordered Bobby and his wife to lie on the floor, but Bobby was not intimidated, on the contrary. He got out of bed and approached the boys, telling them to get out of his house at once. Nervous about the situation, and emboldened by the gun they had, one of the boys pulled the trigger without hesitation, and Bobby took the bullet in the chest and died instantly. His wife stayed in bed and just watched it all happen, which was easily the most tragic part of the story. The boys immediately realized the grave mistake they had just made. They had just fired a gun in the middle of the night in a township with less than 14,000 residents. They had already raised enough money to get out of the city, and if they had chosen to do it that night, they would not have been targeted. They would probably never have been arrested or chased, but they decided to do one more robbery, and now their scenario was notoriously more complicated. It was at this point that they realized the small errors in their initial escape plan, and that is that they had no means of transportation, nor did they have the option of taking a bus or a cab. Now they had committed a serious crime, and by that time everyone around them was probably on alert, as the gunshot must have been heard several blocks away, as well as the screams of Bobby's wife when she saw her husband fall dead on the floor. The boys fled the house and remained in the shadows for the next few days. No one knew where they were. The police searched tirelessly for them but did not find them. By the time I arrived in town, 3 days had passed since Bobby's murder, and there was still no trace of his killers, so the whole community was on alert. I remember coming home from college one day, and when I got home, I saw a patrol car parked out front and a couple of officers talking to my grandfather. The first thing that came to my mind was that the officers were trying to investigate nearby houses. However, upon arrival, the men called my name and asked me to accompany them. This really took me by surprise. I looked at my grandfather and he nodded his head as a sign for me to do as I was asked, so I made my way to the station with the officers. Once there, they began to question me. They asked me questions about the boys and if I knew them. They also asked me how long I had been in town and my reasons for moving there. I answered honestly, although I felt a little nervous without knowing exactly why. Maybe just being taken into a room and interrogated for a crime makes you feel progressively like a criminal. I actually went to high school with them, but only for a couple of years, before I moved to the city with my mother and finished high school there. I won't say they were good kids or anything like that. But when I heard what they did, I was shocked. I mean, these were the kind of kids that would shoot spitballs in class, make loud noises to distract the teacher. It was hard to imagine them breaking into someone's house and murdering them. We were all in shock at what happened, especially when all the details came out. They stole a gun, broke into a house, and attacked a sleeping elderly couple. It was as if we were discussing details of a case in Los Angeles or New York, something completely foreign to this old Colorado town. Once the interrogation was over, the policeman let me go, but not before reminding me that if I had any information, or if I saw them at any time, I should let them know without hesitation. They stressed to me that these 3 boys were dangerous, and that they should be taken off the streets immediately. Later that night, I was in my room studying for an exam I had the next day, when suddenly there was a power outage. I quickly reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight and made my way downstairs. The electrical box for the house was in the basement, so I was about to head down there to check. However, when I was just a few steps away, I heard gunshots and screams. I immediately jumped back and instinctively called my grandfather. I didn't hear an answer right away, but a few minutes later I heard him calling me from the basement. I ran down there, and as I opened the door and went downstairs, I couldn't believe my eyes. The first thing I saw was my grandfather with a bullet wound in his arm, but a few steps away from him, Danny's body was lying, and further away, BJ and Steve were lying face down and with their hands on their heads, both shot in the leg. My grandfather asked me to call the police immediately, and also an ambulance. They didn't even take 10 minutes to arrive. They took the 3 of them away in the ambulance, and my grandfather was taken to make a statement. Long story short, these 3 guys had been staying in the basement of our house for the past 3 days. However, the moment the electricity failed, my grandfather headed down to the basement to check the electrical box, fortunately with his gun in his hand as he had been for the past few days. When he got there, he pointed the flashlight, and that's when he came face to face with the 3 crooks. Danny fired a couple of shots at him, but only managed to hit him in the arm. However, my grandfather is quite an experienced marksman, and he was much faster than him or them. He shot Danny in the abdomen, and the other 2 he shot in each leg to neutralize them, and that was just the moment I arrived. After the incident, my grandfather was acquitted of all charges for acting in self-defense, while these boys were sentenced to several years in prison, with Danny getting the most years, because he was the one who pulled the trigger on both occasions, when Bobby was killed, and he was also the one who shot my grandfather. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. My mother worked 2 jobs in order to support us, as when I was 7 years old, my dad left my mom and never returned, and my brother, unfortunately, has autism. But unlike others, he is actually a little better in his condition, although he rarely speaks or expresses himself like a normal person. But despite this, he is able to do his basic tasks. Most of the day, he sits by the window looking out, saying or doing nothing else. This incident occurred when I was 15 years old and my brother Frank was 11. My mom was working a night shift on a Wednesday, so it was basically just my brother and I at home that day. We were kind of used to being left alone at night because we had no choice. My mom had to work 2 shifts in order to cover household expenses and couldn't afford to pay for a babysitter. Our next-door neighbor was an alcoholic man who had a son close to my age, but we would often hear the man yelling at his son late at night, and sometimes we would even hear banging. This particular night, I was sitting in our living room and watching TV. My brother was upstairs lying in his bed, and suddenly I heard a lot of chaos outside. I opened the door and saw that 3 or 4 people had gathered in front of our neighbor's house, and within 5 or 10 minutes a policeman arrived. They sealed the whole house in seconds. The paramedics even came out and carried a body on a stretcher, and behind them, there was our neighbor, the father, getting into an ambulance with a bleeding head. At first I couldn't understand what was going on, but after listening to the conversations of the people gathered in front of the scene, it gave me a clear idea of what had just happened. It turns out that the father called 911 saying that a homeless man broke into their home and tried to rob them, hit him with a baseball bat and seriously injured him. As he was drunk, he simply fell to the ground in terrible pain in his head. The father saw his son running towards the man to stop him, and it was just as the man hit his son in the back of the head and he fell to the ground. According to the father's account, the man then stole his wallet and some electronics and fled the scene. The policeman registered the father's complaint, but after suffering a huge blood clot inside his brain, his son died in the hospital. That night, our whole town was shaken with fear. No one expected such a terrible tragedy in such a peaceful place. The father organized a small funeral for his son and we all attended. Everyone gave their condolences. The local sheriff assured him that he would find the guy who destroyed his family. My mother was completely terrified and asked Grandma to keep an eye on us during her night shifts. There was a huge commotion in our town because of this event. For his part, our neighbor, Mr. Fellman, had changed a lot after the death of his son. He was often seen sitting on the porch with a terrified look on his face. I could tell he seemed to be suffering from the trauma of that night every second. And no wonder, as that must have been a terrible moment. Having to watch your child die on the ground at the hands of an intruder and not being able to do anything is any parent's nightmare. Mr. Fellman stopped drinking after that incident. He also begged the sheriff to let him move out, as he was traumatized by living in that house. But the ongoing investigation forced him to stay where he was. But my neighbor was not the only one who experienced changes after that terrible tragedy. About a week after the incident, I began to notice strange behavior in my brother, although we never discussed the death of the boy next door for obvious reasons. I am sure my brother must have realized that something happened to our neighbors. After all, he was perfectly aware of what was going on around him, even if he could not express it effectively like anyone else. One day I was doing my schoolwork sitting in the living room. It was a rainy and dull afternoon, and like almost every day, Frank was sitting by the living room window and watching the raindrops fall, and suddenly I heard him laughing. I looked at him and saw that you were looking outside and laughing at something. The street and neighboring houses were visible from that window, so I asked him, "What's so funny?" Frank chuckled and told him and pointed out the window. And I immediately got up and walked over there, stood next to my brother and looked outside. Like I said, it was raining outside. The rain wasn't that heavy. That's why I could clearly see the empty stripe. As far as my eyes could see, I didn't see a single living creature outside. I thought to myself that Frank was probably imagining something, and I laughed about it with him. That night, when we all sat down to dinner, Grank surprised us all with a gesture he made. My mom served him some food and placed the plate in front of him to eat, but my brother got up and slowly went to the kitchen, then brought an extra plate and placed it on the table right next to him. "Why did you bring an extra plate?" my mom said. He looked next to him as if someone was sitting in the chair and started smiling on his own. The truth is that this made me feel very strange. I mean, his behavior was being quite bizarre. He had never done anything like that before, and it didn't make any sense. "Mom is asking you something," my mom told him. Then he looked at our mom and said, "He's hungry, Mom. Serve him too. He's hungry." My mom and I were absolutely flabbergasted by Frank's behavior. She replied quietly and calmly, "Who is he, Frank?" My brother chuckled and said, "My friend Edie." Mom and I thought that, like any normal child, Frank was having an imaginary friend, so that night we didn't react to his sudden strange behavior as he seemed happy, so we decided to play along. Frank often talked and smiled. Whenever anyone asked him, he would say he was talking to his friend Edie. Things never took a different turn, so my brother's behavior never bothered me in a big way. That was until one night I woke up in my room and heard footsteps coming down the stairs. My mom was sleeping downstairs while my brother and I had a room upstairs. I got out of my bed and went to check on Frank, but when I opened the door to his room, I saw that it was empty, so I ran downstairs and found the front door wide open. This scared me to death. I ran out and woke up my mom. Then we both left the house and started calling my brother. We called him for a while without receiving any answer. We also looked for him in the vicinity, but we couldn't find him. My mom was about to cry when we heard a sound of laughter coming from our backyard. We immediately ran over there, and that's when we saw Frank standing under a tree. He had his back to us. So I said to him in a cracked voice, "Frankie, are you okay?" Suddenly he turned towards us. I had never seen my brother like that. His eyes were blood red and his face was full of pain. He said in a harsh voice, "He's buried here." And then he collapsed on the ground. That night, my brother came down with a high fever, and the next morning we called many doctors, but no one could say exactly what was wrong with him. My mom became tense and worried. She hardly slept at night and was very stressed. One night I saw my mom talking to our town sheriff, who was standing in the doorway. After the sheriff left, I asked my mom what he was saying, and she replied that the sheriff was going to close the next door neighbor's file. They did a lot of investigating but could not locate the intruder who broke into their house that night. Hearing this, my eyes suddenly widened like saucers, and I asked my mom what was the name of Mr. Fellman's son. She answered, I think his name was Edie. Why are you asking me? My head started to throb with terror. Is this even possible? The imaginary friend my brother was talking about was none other than our neighbor's dead son. I ran to Frank's room and he was mumbling something in his sleep. I went up to him and said, Frank, is Edie here with you? Now you're just going to have to trust me. I'm not making this up at all. My brother suddenly opened his eyes and looked towards the corner of the room. As I followed his eyes, my heart skipped a beat in fear. A person was standing in the darkness in the corner of Frank's room. His eyes were pale white with small pupils sprouting from them. Only his face was particularly visible as his whole body was in darkness. Spots of dried blood were visible on his cheek and the left side of his forehead. He then looked at me and my brother. Frankie slowly got up from his bed and then began to walk out of the room. I followed him downstairs while my mom was sitting in the living room, but suddenly she saw Frank walking alone in the middle of this fever and ran towards him. But before she could do anything else, I stopped her. I grabbed her arm and told her everything. Then my mom and I left the house following my brother, who was walking us towards the backyard. I stopped on the right, in front of the tree. This tree was in the middle of our backyard and the backyard of our neighbor, Mr. Fellman. Frank then pointed to the ground under the tree and said, "Dig here," and then passed out on the ground. Without wasting a single second, I told my mom to call the sheriff. She did so immediately, and he came with 2 other police officers. People from our neighborhood gathered in our backyard out of curiosity. Then, in front of all the neighbors, the cops started digging under the tree, and what they found still causes me nightmares to this day. There, under our tree, they found a bloody baseball bat wrapped in a cloth buried shallowly. Then the mystery unfolded, shocking our entire community once again. As you can imagine, it was not a homeless man, but Mr. Feldman himself, who murdered his own son in a drunken delirium. But to save himself from the law, he decided to make up the whole story of the robbery and hurt himself to make the situation more believable, and even secretly buried the murder weapon because he knew that without the murder weapon, no police would have caught the killer. That was the reason he wanted to move so badly. The police arrested him that day, and surprisingly, my brother was completely better the next day. We still live in that house, and I believe William has finally been able to rest in peace. We watched with my family in a small town in Ohio. My older brother and I would stay home inside. Ever since we moved there, my mother implemented a sort of rule in the house. After a certain time, she would take away our cell phones and hide them inside the safe. A safe that neither my brother nor I had the combination to. Only she did. This, she said, was to keep us grounded and not alienated all day in a virtual world. Although this seemed like a silly and arbitrary measure, it was Mom and Dad's rules, so there was little we could do about it. Our grandparents lived on the same street, and my great-grandmother lived in a little house they built on that same property, so she could feel more independent. But they would still be around to take care of her. Our parents told us they were going to go see my great-grandmother since our grandparents were out of town that day. They also told us that when they got back we would order pizza, which sounded good to 7-year-old me and my 14-year-old brother, who I will call Max. That afternoon, my brother and I played video games for quite a while, and soon we started to get hungry. I kept asking when our parents would be back. I would say that after about 2 hours of them leaving, we heard a knock on the driveway. I immediately got excited, thinking it was my parents with the pizza, so I ran downstairs and my brother followed close behind. I approached the door, which had a large window, only to find that it wasn't our parents. It was a very tall, thin white guy with short, scruffy black hair. I'd say maybe 24 or 25 years old. The man was quite jarring because everyone knew everyone in this small town and we had no idea who he was. I raised my finger for about a second at him and then closed the curtain. I turned to see Max looking at the door with a look of disbelief because he had seen this person too. A few seconds later, that knock turned into a pounding, and then it turned into shaking and rattling of our doorknob. Now we were terrified and with no way to call our parents. Max grabbed my hand and pulled me into the kitchen. There he grabbed a knife, and I distinctly remember it snapping in his hand. It broke on the small blade and fell out of the handle. At that time, for some reason, our kitchen was very shabby. A lot of rusty utensils and things were matted, and there were all kinds of broken things. All kinds of things and in disrepair. However, seeing that we didn't have too much to defend ourselves with, we both hid inside the laundry room and hugged each other, even hearing those knocks on the door. The banging continued for about 5 minutes, but to us it felt like hours. Then we listened in terror as the front door opened. One thing I will say about my brother is that he has always been ready to protect me at any time. So, in this situation, he was ready to jump on whoever was there and stick that crappy knife in him just to defend me. However, it was my mother rounding the corner holding 2 pizza boxes and some soda, wondering why her 2 sons were in that corner with their faces full of tears on the floor. We both stood up and ran to tell her about that man we saw outside, but were met with laughter, and then we saw that my dad was outside talking to him. He said he was inquiring about buying a broken-down car that has been in the driveway for a few months. Apparently he was a mechanic. My mom felt terrible but found the situation a little funny. Apparently she came out and told the man what we told him, and he said he felt really bad for scaring us. Then we got hugs and promised us the phones were not locked up. They didn't give them back when they left again. I spent the rest of the night eating pizza with choking sobs. Something was still bothering me. Although it was not clear to me as a child if I could feel that anyone was okay. Why would a grown man knock on the door like that? He would shake the handle and do everything he could to get into the house. I mean, if you see a child raise his finger and make a gesture like looking for a grown person to come open, why would you have to start forcing the door? That made no sense. And somehow my childish mind knew it. Besides, why would someone come in the middle of the night to ask about selling a vehicle that didn't have any kind of sign advertising that it was for sale? It's a little scary to think about my parents ignoring this completely, just like that. But something in my gut, especially being an adult now, told me that's not the way adults, at least normal adults, act. The guy's name ended up being Hugo. He came by the house a few more times that week to inspect that old beat-up car. The first time he stopped by, our parents were home, so he popped the hood and got under it, checked just about everything. From what I can remember, everything was, I guess, friendly that first visit, except sometimes I noticed him looking at me and my brother, giving us this weird, creepy smile. He came by a few days later that same week, but the next time it was at a weird time again, and our parents weren't home now that we knew this guy. So Max opened the door for him and he said, "Hey, sorry to bother you, but I'd like to check something else on the car." "No problem, but our parents aren't here, so you have to come back tomorrow," Max explained. "Oh, it's really no big deal. I just wanted to check the tires and wheel wells real quick. It won't take any time at all." Like I said, we already knew the guy, so Max saw nothing wrong with letting him do what he said he was going to do. Then he closed the door and we watched him from the living room window as he went back to his own car, another old jalopy that looked like it was coming apart. He rummaged around inside, then walked over to the other wagon he wanted to buy, and proceeded to do exactly what he said he was going to do. After a few minutes we got bored, left the window and continued doing what we were doing. However, he did something strange that immediately caught our attention. He turned around and walked straight into the house, taking pictures of the outside. He took pictures of the sides, the front, the second floor, and then went to the backyard. That's when he noticed us looking wide-eyed through the front window. There, he put the camera away and waved, then pointed to the front door as if to suggest we meet him there. Max came over and told me to stand by the phone in case something happened. He put in Dad's number, so I only had to press the call button. Then he told me to call 911 and then Dad. They talked for a minute at the door, before Mex closed it again and came back. He was white as a sheet of paper at that point. He looked like a ghost. He didn't look the same. I asked him what had happened and if I should call, and he shook his head, no. To this day, I still don't know what that guy said to Max, as he has always been secretive about it. But he has definitely intrigued me for years, especially with my imagination running wild with all kinds of theories. Once my parents got home, he said something to them. I remember my dad went to his office to call Hugo, and he did it very angrily. We could hear his very stern voice through the door, but eventually he softened, hung up, and went back out. He then explained to us that it was some sort of misunderstanding, much like that first experience we had with him. But he was taking pictures of the house, I told my dad. But he quickly gave me this funny look and said something like, Hugo just took pictures of the house with one of those paper cameras. Max immediately backed me up in my concern. Then my dad explained that that would be some sort of toy cameras that used wrapping paper, or something like that. I understood. The thing is, Dad dismissed it completely and told us that he would talk to him later, but that he would not call him back that night. After that, he watched us go to sleep. Max and I looked at each other and reluctantly went to bed. I remember lying there in the dark for most of my night, staring at the window, wondering if I would see a flash come in through the blinds. Why on earth would he do that? Why would he take pictures of our house? Max had his own theory about it. He thought he did it in order to have an outside layout of all the entrances and exits, and I guess in my kid brain that made sense. But it really freaked me out. The next time Hugo came over, it was the following Monday. I was actually home alone. Max and I got out of school at about the same time. We rode the bus home as usual, but when we got off, he opened the door for me, dropped me off at home, and walked a couple of blocks to his friend's house. It wasn't very unusual for him to leave me alone for 30 or 40 minutes, at which point he would run back and run into the house, just before our parents got home from work. It was harmless. I didn't mind being home alone because I could do whatever I wanted, eat some snacks, all that good stuff. But about 5 minutes after sitting on the couch with my juice box and gummies, there's a knock on the door. I immediately froze and set about disappearing into the cushions. I remember trying hard not to wet my pants. I have to remind you that I was 6 or maybe 7 at the time, so it shouldn't have been a surprise. Fortunately, I knew better than to open the door, so I did the only thing that made sense and pretended no one was home, so whoever it was would be out shortly. That made sense, didn't it? But that's not what happened. The person behind the door kept knocking. They were aggressive knocks, which took me back to the first time Hugo came to the house. I knew something was wrong and I knew it was him, so I didn't even bother to look out the window. I just kept sitting on the couch until finally, to my relief, he stopped. He had been watching the clock on the radio for 9 minutes, and it passed as he knocked on the door, even more than that first time. Hugo was truly unhinged, and the worst part was that he didn't leave. I remained completely terrified as I watched him creep around the other side of the house, checking the dining room window, the biggest one I can ever remember. My throat almost closed completely in anxiety when I heard it open and felt the warm air coming in from the yard hit my face. He leaned over and looked into the living room, and at that moment we looked into each other's eyes. He held up a single hand and then waved at me like I was a puppet or something, then gave me that awful smile and said, "Hey, Mom and Dad aren't home yet, are they?" I didn't say anything. Then he crawled the rest of the way through the window frame. I was so terrified I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move a muscle. Even with him inside the house, I wasn't able to move to even run. To this day, that was the most terrifying experience of my life. I couldn't see what he was doing as he moved through the house, somewhere down the hallway across the dining room. The only things down there were Max's bedroom and my parents' bedroom, and finally the front door leading outside. He never went back to the living room, which was where I was, so whatever he wanted to look for inside our house, he was inside those rooms. After standing there for quite a while, he finally came back and greeted me. He did it the same way he did at the beginning, that is, waving his arm like a puppet. But this time he waved goodbye, and then slid back down the hallway. I'll never forget watching his arm snake around with his t-shirt in his hand, wiping all his footprints behind him before closing the window. He knew I was just a kid, and that it was possible no one would believe me, and I think he was actually counting on that. Finally, my brother came home to find me in hysterics on the couch. I started shaking after he left out of fear. I spilled my juice box on the couch, which made me think even more that I was now in more trouble. I told him what had happened, or tried to, and watched his face twist in worry and panic. He finally understood what I was saying. Hugo came in, knocked on the door before he came through the kitchen window into the house, and... "He touched you," Max interrupted me with visible fear on his face. I shook my head and he nodded, then ran to the phone, called my dad, and before I knew it, both parents were walking in the front door. They questioned me pretty thoroughly. I started to explain about the spilled juice, but all they wanted to know was what happened with Hugo. Finally, my dad asked me which window I had come in through, and I pointed to the kitchen window. He felt it, and then asked me which way I had gone in the hallway. And I told him towards the bedrooms and pointed exactly where he went. He, just like Max, asked me if he had done anything to me, and I again shook my head, just told him about the greeting and what he did with his shirt as he went out the window again. My parents and Max shared a look and then quietly agreed to go check their rooms. They understood. He must have gone into one of their rooms. A few minutes later, I heard Max make this strange gagging sound, and our parents quickly rushed to his room. At the time, I really wasn't sure what they found, or what grossed Max out so much that it made him want to throw up. But then they saw that there was some kind of weird stuff of his missing used underwear, a hairbrush, pictures of his corkboard, among other kinds of creepy, super creepy stuff. After this, my dad called Hugo nonstop for the next 24 hours, but never got him to answer. He never came for the car, never paid us, never picked it up. It was all a scam, just to get close to my brother. A few years later, when I was in high school, I came across a story in the newspaper, underneath which was a large picture of Hugo, which wasn't even his real name. This man had been caught and put in prison for crimes related to child molestation, sexual harassment, and trespassing. After the incident at the house, my parents called the police and gave them a detailed report of his actions, but we never saw him again, and the police never caught him, until I saw this story in the newspaper 10 years later. All my life I had heard stories about hidden villages in remote places, lost in time, either because of abandonment or because people preferred to move to more urban areas. This always made me very curious, and I wanted to see if some of what people talked about these towns was true. So one day I set out to visit a supposedly abandoned village that was a few miles from my town, and which was quite popular among people curious about these things like me. However, when I got there, I was very disappointed to learn that it had basically turned into a tourist trap, as it was far from being abandoned. On the contrary, it was completely full of people, and there were souvenir stores and guided tours and all this stuff. Still, I had a good time, but it was not at all what I expected from that place, probably because it was too popular. I wondered if the meaning behind the words hidden village was that the village itself was literally hidden from the human eye, and if these places really existed. Let's see. I live in a big city full of people, and the closest thing to a hidden village is what I just described to you. However, one day, while I was looking at posts on a Facebook page related to the subject, I came across by chance with another supposed hidden village that was in the neighboring city, and that apparently very few people knew about. The best thing is that it did not seem very complicated to get to it, only that it was in a very remote area where there was no civilization for miles. However, I would need to hike, and since one of my best friends is an avid mountaineer, I asked him if he was up for coming with me on this exploratory trip, and he loved the idea. That same night, I found the exact location of where the hidden village was supposed to be, and the next morning we set off. We arrived at the site about 4 hours later. We parked the car in an old parking lot nearby and started walking. My friend was very excited about this walk, and I was also looking forward to the hike. The weather was perfect, and the route itself wasn't half as difficult as I expected, so we could. However, we didn't find the hidden village, but instead looked at other points of interest highlighted on the map, historical stuff and other things, especially since this whole area had been part of a mining complex many years ago, but was now completely abandoned. However, our little expedition had to be interrupted momentarily, as the sky turned a deep shade of gray and we knew it was going to rain. The rain was light at first, but then it came down incredibly hard. We hadn't planned on needing shelter, but we did. We had seen a stone monument not long ago, which had an archway, and we thought this would be big enough for both of us to hide from the rain under. We walked back through a high area through some trees, and in 5 minutes we were there. I guess because I had walked so much that day, I was more tired than I thought I would be, because I suddenly started to feel incredibly sleepy. By the time I got back, I had to sit under the eaves of that stone structure, as my head was spinning, and my friend must have been experiencing something similar, as he was mirroring my movements. After an unknown period of time, I woke up. I didn't even realize I had fallen asleep. What caused me to wake up was the sound of someone's voice that I didn't know, which meant that someone else was here with us. The rain had also stopped, and it was a little scary, so I slowly opened my eyes, just a little, to try to see who was there. With squinted eyes, I saw several figures in front of us and noticed that despite the rain, the sun was still in the sky, so it was early yet. The figures were in shadow. I couldn't make out their features because they were just inside the dense line of trees surrounding the monument. I was gradually coming to my senses, and that's when I discovered something strange. I heard these figures talking, but their voices sounded very unusual. They were higher pitched than usual, and what they were saying didn't seem to make sense either, or at least not to me. I was now sitting on the floor with my knees drawn up to my chest and my head bent forward. I had barely lifted my head a little when I heard the strange voices, but it was enough to see the figures among the trees. I looked up a little more and saw that there were 3 of these tall figures. They looked humanoid. They sure looked like they were wearing hats, like farmers' hats or something. But for some reason, my vision was blurry. No matter how hard I tried to make them out, I couldn't. I tried to stand up, but my body decided not to. I remained frozen where I was, then the figures began to move. They moved so fast and strangely, it was as if I was watching a single frame of a video. Their movements were disjointed and unsettling, and they were walking towards me. At that moment, a hitherto unknown kind of fear struck me to the core. One of these beings had something in his hand. It looked like a stick, and he was shaking it as if he was very angry. Although I could not understand what they were saying, I understood that the tone seemed annoyed. Their voices sounded as if they were playing a tape in fast forward. It was something very strange, surreal. I felt like in some kind of dream, but I was sure I was awake. One of them broke away from the others and approached me. I still couldn't move, but I could feel beads of sweat sliding down from my forehead to my eyes and nose. I was completely terrified. I thought I would never stop sweating. It was hell. Then his dark face came very close to mine, and he was still chattering angrily with that fast tape voice. But the strangest thing was that I still couldn't distinguish him. I was still seeing blurry. But at that moment, something even stranger started to happen. And that is that I started to feel an intense heat. It was as if a burning ember was right in front of me. I literally felt like I was burning alive, but I still couldn't move. What the fuck? I was shaking but paralyzed and burning. I couldn't understand anything. That's when I heard that shadowy figure in the hat say something slower, and strangely I could understand it perfectly. "Get out of here, and if you come back, I'll kill you." At that moment, my consciousness was cut off. When I woke up, the rain had stopped a long time ago, because the ground wasn't even wet anymore. I felt as if I had just woken up from a nightmare. The sky looked deceptively clear, and I realized that I could move again. And the first thing I did was to go to my friend, who was still sound asleep. I saw that he was covered in sweat, just as I was. I shook him, trying to wake him up, but he didn't move right away. He only moved when I said, "Hey, it's me." Then he opened his eyes, startled, and with a clear expression of panic. I'm sure he saw the same dark figures that I had seen, and probably he also heard what that thing said. At that moment, my friend jumped to his feet and started walking back the way we came, looking very scared and not saying a word. Then he looked over his shoulder at me as if to say, "I'm not waiting for you," so I followed him immediately and we ran back down the mountain trail to the car. During the drive, neither of us said a word. No one wanted to talk about the figures we had seen and everything that happened at that monument. During the walk back, I began to think that maybe it could have been a dream, but it all seemed too real. However, when we got to the car, I saw something on my clothes that removed all vestige of doubt. I noticed that my polyester shirt was slightly burned, blackened, and toasted. And as I looked at my friend, I realized that his was exactly the same. My heart started beating very fast, almost as if it was going to burst out of my chest, but I got in the truck, started it up, and sped out of there, and never went back to that place again, just as I never felt like visiting any other abandoned town in my life. Hi, my name is Amanda. I recently had to move to a new neighborhood because of a scary incident I had with another resident of the town I was living in. This guy had become obsessed with me to the point that he tried to kidnap me and almost took my life in the process. Currently, this man is in prison and will be for at least a few years. However, his family still lives in the same neighborhood, and they have threatened my family on more than one occasion, which is why my mom decided that we would be safer somewhere else. But we had to leave without warning and without arousing suspicion. So a couple of weeks ago, we packed everything we could into our car and snuck out in the middle of the night without anyone knowing where we were going. But that's the end of this real-life horror story, or at least what has been written so far, because honestly, I don't think this is over yet. However, today I am going to relate to you how this all came to pass. My mother and my younger sister had lived in that small Wisconsin town for the past 7 years, before I moved in with them. I have been living with my father in California since he and my mother divorced. I like living there and didn't want to leave my friends, but I hardly ever saw my sister, and we missed each other too much. So one day I made the decision to move to Wisconsin with them. The day I arrived, I noticed a group of older guys, about 18 or 19 years old, standing in front of the house, and one of them was sitting under a tree staring at me. There was something about the way he was looking at me that really made me feel very uncomfortable. This was Brand, and he would be the boy who almost took my life, only I had no idea about it then. The first few times we saw each other, he kept his distance. It would take him about a month to introduce himself, and it was more because circumstances forced it, as we coincidentally met at the bus stop and almost collided. That day, our gazes met for the first time, and I still remember that strange feeling of indecision I had when I looked into his eyes. On the one hand, he was a very handsome guy, but deep down I had that feeling of distrust that is like your sixth sense warning you that this person is not good for you. We stared at each other without saying anything for a few moments before he finally introduced himself, and I did the same. He offered me his hand, and we gave each other a very awkward handshake, which was the beginning of a short but eventually terrifying friendship. Our first day together would be fun, and there would be no indication of how things would go. Brand remained shy for a while, and that day he didn't say much. We were at a mutual friend's house who was having a birthday and invited us over. There weren't many people there. In fact, there were only 5 of us: her, Brand, Marshall, Angelica, and me. That day, I was having a good time with everyone, but shortly after cutting the cake, Marshall and Angelica left, and only Susie, Brand, and I were left. But I didn't understand why Brand would stay, since basically only Susie and I were interacting, as he was most of the meeting, sitting on the couch without saying anything. There came a point when Susie had to go to the bathroom, and Brand and I were left alone in the living room. At that point, I found myself making small talk to avoid any awkward silence. He had told me about a nearby wooded area where the other older guys were hanging out and invited me to join them the next afternoon. I didn't see anything wrong. On the contrary, I was almost new in town, and that seemed like a good opportunity to meet other guys. The next day, he picked me up at my house to go where he told me to go, and when we arrived, there were already 3 other guys, a boy and 2 girls, who were smoking. Brand and I stayed for a while and smoked with the group. This wasn't new to me, as when I lived with my dad, I also used to sneak a smoke with a group of neighborhood friends. By the end of that day, everything went well, and I had made 3 new friends. After that, he and I continued to hang out in the clubhouse, as we called the wooded area where we met to smoke, and generally got along great, until the day he asked me to be his girlfriend. That day, the question took me by surprise, honestly. Although he was handsome and so far he was nice, I was not attracted to him as a boyfriend. I saw him more as a good friend, and that was how I wanted things to go on. But I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I tried to turn him down as gently as I could. He didn't say anything, and I thought he was just a little disappointed. So, to smooth things over, I quickly changed the subject. But perhaps I did it in a very abrupt way. I had seen a tabby cat walking about 30 feet away from us, and I commented something like, "Oh, a kitty. Look how cute. Come, kitty, come." Then he did something that really shocked me. He picked up a handful of rocks and started throwing them at the poor creature. Fortunately, he missed every shot. But this horrified and annoyed me in equal measure, so I started yelling at him what the heck was wrong with him, got very upset and went home. I got home, not really sure about the future of our friendship, but we met up later in the week. Brand's brother and a few others were swimming at a neighbor's pool, and they invited my sister and I to join them, so we did. I ran home and put on my favorite swimsuit, joined them and jumped in the pool. I was having fun splashing around with the others, and cooling off a bit because it seemed to be over 100 degrees that day, and the water felt great. At one point, I got out of the pool to get a drink of water and was talking to one of the guys I had just met, when out of nowhere, Brand ran over to where we were and pushed the guy into the pool. Everyone, including the victim, started yelling at him and asking him why the hell he had done that. But instead of apologizing, he went away kicking things, just like he had done in the woods. Later we met again, in a little square that was in the center of town, and where we all gathered in the evenings to hang out, and then I asked him why he had done it, and he said he had been overcome with jealousy when he saw me talking to the boy. He told me he didn't want to see me with another boy, and insisted that he was in love with me and that no one else would love me like he did. To be honest, he didn't say it in an aggressive way, but there was something about the way he looked at me, and the way he uttered those words that made me shiver. If I was smart, I would have run away at that moment, but the truth is that in a way I felt sorry for him and assured him that I had no interest in that boy. The smile and look of pure relief on his face after those words should have been another warning sign, but we've already established that I'm not very smart. The rest of the day went well, and nothing spooky would happen all week. We had been playing games for a fortnight and smoking at a friend's house. That afternoon, Brand tried to steal a kiss from me. This pissed me off and I started yelling at him. He made a sad face to make me feel sorry for him. And if this had been the first time he had tried it, I might have let it go. But he had tried it just the day before in the woods, and there was no one there to see it at the time. But that day, a room full of people saw us, and that was the last straw. I told Brand that he was overstepping his bounds and I wasn't going to let him disrespect me like that. I left there after that. I was very angry and had no intention of talking to him again. But he came to my door the next day as if nothing had happened. I left him greetings before slamming the door in his face. My hope was that he would get the point and leave me alone. But within hours, the apology messages started and would continue for at least another week. I almost responded to one just to tell him to leave me alone, but my sister convinced me that it would only give him hope and that it would never stop after that. This time I decided to heed him and not respond. The messages eventually stopped on their own, and for the first time in almost a month, I had reason to hope that it was all over. Things soon began to calm down, and there was no sign of Brand being out. I say this because the last few weeks he had been laying siege to my house every day, all day, which forced me to stay locked up. But I was already starting to go crazy. So that day, after scanning the area around my house and across the road for Brand, I deemed it safe to take the short walk to the mailboxes. I walked out the door slowly at first, ready to run back inside upon seeing him for the first time. But the closer I got, the more confident I became. A few pieces of junk mail were all that greeted me. Feeling a little more relaxed, I sucked in a lungful of the warm afternoon air and headed back into the house. I took a moment to tie my shoes, and as I did so, I thought this would be the perfect time for Brand to accost me. But when I finished and kept walking, he was nowhere in sight. I was so relieved. I could see my door as I rounded the corner, and then I stepped out of the near darkness, but then Brand came out from behind the wall and grabbed me from behind. But before I could scream for help, he quickly covered my mouth with his hand, drowning out my screams. But just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I felt the sharp point of the knife under my ribs, and I knew this was very bad. Brand dragged us behind the wall of the house, which was alone, and told me he needed to talk. When we were safely hidden, he slowly removed his hand from my mouth, but I realized he was watching and waiting to see if I made a sound, and I thought about screaming at the top of my lungs. But then, the presence of the knife resting just on the right side of my neck prevented me from doing more than whispering to him to please let me go. He told me again that he wasn't going to hurt me, and that he just wanted to talk to me and explain how he felt about me. The knife made me think otherwise. I asked him as quietly as possible that if that was true, why was he attacking me with a knife? "This is the only way to do it. Now I need you to listen," he told me. His response was swift and sure. The shy and reserved Brand seemed to have vanished. It seems that the knife had inoculated him with a sense of power he lacked without it. This realization terrified me even more, and left me with little doubt as to what I would do if I challenged that power. I decided then and there that I was going to do whatever it took to get out of this alive. "Well, I'm listening," I told him then, and made sure to use the softest tone of feminine voice I could. I also relaxed my body to give him the idea that I was complying willingly. He said there were too many distractions where we were, that he was going to take me to the clubhouse so we could be alone. I smothered the chill as best I could, and the only thought I had was that he would take me there and kill me. And if this was the case, I was going to try to free myself whenever I could, even if I had to kill him to do it. We started walking. I was in front and he followed behind me as we headed into the woods, pressing the tip of the blade firmly against my spine the whole way. Along the way, he told me how he had fallen in love with me the moment he saw me, and how angry he felt every time another boy spoke to me. I didn't say anything all this time, and the truth was doing my best to block out what he was saying, and looking for my chance to escape. As we got closer, I could see a campfire burning in the distance. My God, how long has he been planning this, I thought. When we arrived, we sat down together on a long log he had laid out on the spot. He looked into my eyes wistfully and talked about how much I had hurt him by refusing to be his girlfriend. He had clung to the hope that he and I belonged to each other, and he got the idea that if he kissed me, maybe I would realize that I loved him too. For a brief moment, I forgot how I had been brought there, and a feeling of pity crept into my mind. But it was fleeting, and what he said next would bring me back to the gravity of my situation and convince me that my earlier suspicions were true. He said that unfortunately, time had shown him that I would never be ready to accept our fate together, and that he was a fool to think that such a beautiful girl would ever want to be with a loose screw like him. And then he said the creepiest thing I've ever heard, that a dream he had showed him that if we died together, things would be better. When he said this, he hid his face, and tears started to fall from his eyes. Then he raised his hand with the knife to wipe away the tears, and I realized that was the only chance I would have to escape from there alive. So I took that split second, where he looked down and took the knife from me, to get to my feet and start running as fast as my legs could move. It was dark, but I had run that way enough times to know that the set of lights in the distance belonged to the houses in town. Only once did I dare to look back and saw that he was uncomfortably close, but I gave it all I had, knowing that if he caught me I was dead, and that was incentive enough not to faint a step. I got closer to the edge of the trees and I could see the lights of the town getting closer and closer, so I started screaming for help. The burning in my legs was becoming unbearable, and I knew I couldn't go much further, and suddenly as I approached the street, poof, A mass of bright lights flooded everything in front of me and I hit something. But before I fell, someone grabbed me and lifted me up. For a second I thought Brand had caught me and I thought, that's it, that's the end of me. So I let out the loudest scream I have ever emitted in my life. I screamed so loud that my lungs burned because I was not going to die quietly and meekly. If it was my end, someone had to hear, even if it was my last cry of despair. But then, a calm voice told me, "Calm down, it's over." He came closer and put his hand on my head. Then I looked up for the last time, knowing that face would be the last thing I would see. But the face was not Brand's. It was an older man with a bushy mustache. And when our eyes met, he said what sounded like music to me at that moment. "Easy, girl. You're safe. I'm a cop." Then I looked around and saw that there were 3 patrol cars on the street, and a couple of officers were taking Brand handcuffed inside one of them. The nightmare was finally over. My mother and sister put their arms around me. We hugged each other tightly and cried like babies. My mother and sister, seeing that I wasn't coming, immediately feared the worst and called the police, and they were looking for me all afternoon. A few minutes later, the ambulance arrived, and they checked me over and made sure I was all right. Eventually, Brand was taken away, and when it came time to determine his bail, it was decided not to give him any, so at least until the trial dates, he will be stuck in jail. However, the nightmare was not quite over, as after all this happened, we started having a lot of problems with Brand's family, as they hold me responsible for what happened. Can you believe it? His parents told everyone that I was a harpy who had deceived and manipulated their son, to the point of causing him to have a nervous breakdown. One day they egged my mom's car and broke our windows. Even after we called the police, we had no proof that they did it. And since then, the situation only got worse and worse. And if I learned anything from this terrifying experience, it's that you don't let warnings go, because then it may be too late. So we preferred to put ground to earth and moved into this neighborhood. It's only been a few months since this happened, and from what the district attorney told me, it will probably be more than a year before the trial begins. But as this goes on and the trial comes, I want to be at peace and recover from this bitter experience. Before I begin, I must clarify that this story is very, very dark, so it is not suitable for sensitive people. If this is your case, it is better to omit it. There is a small town about an hour and a half from where I live that has a very popular festival that is held every fall, and people come from all over the state to participate. I'm not going to say the name of the town for privacy reasons, but this is also a complete cell phone dead zone, which was one of the crucial factors in the events unfolding the way they did. The thing is, my brothers and I had wanted to attend this festival for a long time, and this year we were finally able to do so. It was a warm Sunday and my younger brother, 23, my older brother, 30, and myself, 27, got in my van and set off for this town to enjoy the festival. I remember we were really excited about the classic car show they were going to have there, as we all really like classic cars. This town is really small, and that day everything was bursting with people, and there was practically no place to park. So we had to park in the middle of the public park parking lot, which was across the river from the town, which meant we had about a 15-minute walk, and we had to cross a bridge to get to town. We didn't mind, however, as the weather was perfect outside, so we left the van in the parking lot and started heading for the first of the 2 bridges we had to cross. Just before we got to the first bridge, a very pretty Asian lady, probably in her late 20s to early 25s, approached us asking how to get to the festival, and we told her how to get there, but she still didn't seem to understand, so, being overly nice guys, we decided to let her follow us to the festival, which I now know was a fatal mistake. We started walking with the girl to the festival, and she seemed very nice and charming, especially to my younger brother, who apparently was not indifferent to the girl's attention. We arrived in the small town finally, and my older brother and I wanted to go and see the festival, especially the classic car exhibition, as that was the most important thing for us, basically the reason why we came here. But the girl said she was looking for a particular place in town where a certain event of the festival was taking place, but she didn't know how to find it. Although this was the first time we came to the festival, It wasn't the first time we were in town. In fact, we had come many times before with my father to fish, so we knew the area quite well. So, being very nice to the girl, my younger brother offered to take her there and told us that he would then meet us at the car show. We agreed, but then we didn't know that that would be the last time we would see him for 2 years. After leaving my little brother with the girl, my older brother and I went to the car show, and after we started admiring all the classic cars, of course, we completely forgot about our little brother, as we were too distracted to notice that it had been a while, and he still hadn't arrived. Before we knew it, it was almost noon, and that's when we realized that our brother still hadn't come to pick us up. This puzzled us, but we didn't think anything was wrong at the time. We tried to call him, but quickly realized that there was no cell phone service in town. As I said before, we weren't too worried yet, so we decided to go for lunch. We had lunch at one of the local restaurants, and after we sat down and placed our order, I looked out the window and noticed a payphone across the street, so I decided to try it and see if I could get through to Lou. I crossed the street, taking advantage of the fact that we were still waiting for our food, and tried calling my brother's number, but the call didn't go through, so he most likely didn't have a signal either. I hung up the phone and went back to the restaurant where our food had finally been served, so we started eating. After lunch, we decided to walk around and went to visit some of the street vendors, while trying to keep an eye out to see if we saw my younger brother. Although with the amount of people there, it was really difficult. By the time it was 4 o'clock, we were already quite worried and didn't know what to do. So we walked to one of the local police officers who was monitoring the festival and explained the situation. He quickly radioed the other officers to be on the lookout. But again, with the amount of people on site, it would be really hard to get a hold of him specifically. At 6 p.m., we were walking all over town to try to find him, but we didn't see any sign of him anywhere. It was at that point that we were no longer enjoying the festival, far from it, and just wanted to find our brother and go home. In less time than we thought, it was 7 p.m., and it was starting to get dark. We had already decided to go back to our car and see if we could wait for him there. We were sure that, come that time, that would be the first place he would go. I checked my phone again and still had no bars, so I couldn't call anyone. Another hour passed and there was no sign of Lou, but I didn't want to leave and have to leave my younger brother stranded there, so we sat in the car for a while longer. By about 10 p.m., it was completely dark and there was still no sign of him. By then, we were the only car left in the parking lot, and a ranger pulled up next to us and told us that the park was closed and we had to leave. We explained the situation to the ranger, and he said he would also radio the local police department. We gave him our phone numbers and he said he would sit on this lot for a while and see if anyone matching my brother's description would show up. I still didn't want to drive an hour home at this point without him. So the ranger suggested we get a room at a nearby hotel so we wouldn't be too far away, and we had no choice but to do so. Fortunately, we got a hotel that had 2 rooms. We paid, and when we got to the room, I called the ranger to let him know which room we were in case he needed to contact us, and gave him the number of the phone that was on the nightstand in our room as well. I took a shower, then sat on the bed and connected to the hotel Wi-Fi so I could check to see if my brother had left me any messages, but there was nothing. I tried calling him again, but it went straight to voicemail. I left him a message telling him where we were, and even sent him a text message. I left my phone on and tried to go to sleep, but needless to say, we didn't sleep very well that night, so the next morning the first thing we did was check our phones, Big Brother too, and to my surprise there was no message from our younger brother. No voicemail, no text message, nothing. As you all can expect, we were very worried at this point. I mean, normally he always kept in touch with us, no matter what. That morning, after breakfast, we immediately went to the local police department and filed a missing person report, and they immediately issued a missing person alert for that day. By then it was Monday, and the festival was over, so the city was cleared and all roads were open again. That's why we decided to drive all over town to see if we could find him somewhere. Now, as I said in the beginning, this city was not very big. It was a village, really, and it only had about 8 blocks and 5 roads that ran parallel to each other. We drove around each and every one of them, but we found nothing. although we even checked the outskirts of the city, but we never found even a small clue where our brother might be. For the next week, we stayed in that hotel, while several friends joined our search and tried every possible way to contact him, by messenger email, video calls, everything, but got no response either. All my messages on Messenger were received but not read, so I knew his phone had to be on somewhere. I even posted on Facebook about the whole thing and told everyone I knew to be on the lookout. After about a week, my older brother and I hesitantly returned home, because we couldn't take any more time off work. For the next few months, we even littered that town with flyers, all in the hope that someone would find him, but we never got any leads. After a few months without getting any leads, the town's police department had to call off the search operation altogether, because they had more important things to worry about. Now they also cut all funding to the department. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President. So a year goes by, and then two, and we don't hear anything from my brother. By then, we had pretty much lost all hope completely, and we had already made up our minds that he wasn't alive, so we just wanted to at least be able to find his body and give him a decent funeral. My parents were devastated. My mother had to take pills to sleep through it all. Not knowing where my brother was much more painful and torturous than the fact that he was dead. But one day, after more than 2 years of anguish and uncertainty, we received a call, literally a week before Christmas. It was the town police department, and what they told us left us totally horrified. The cops told us that they had made a drug raid on an RV that was in an RV park on the outskirts of town, this after receiving a tip from some neighbors who saw a drug deal. The raid was supposed to happen a year ago, but due to budget problems they couldn't do it until now. But when they raided the trailer, they found, among other victims, my younger brother, tied up in one of the bedrooms, severely dehydrated, malnourished, and injured. When they took him to the hospital and questioned him, he said that the same Asian lady at the festival had taken him down an alley, where 3 guys had jumped him and then thrown him into the back of an old ice cream truck before taking him to the trailer. Once there, he had been repeatedly abused and then used as a slave for some really bad things, had been given banned substances against his will, and subjected to all sorts of cruelties over these past 2 years. I think there is no way to describe what a family can feel when they receive information like that. On the one hand, we were happy to know that my brother had turned up alive, but on the other hand, knowing all the agony he went through broke us all into 1,000 pieces. My brother spent 3 months in the hospital recovering physically from everything that was done to him, and he is still in therapy to this day to deal with the trauma of that horrible experience, but it has not been easy. The police department said he was probably part of a large human trafficking ring that used the Asian girl to lure victims. Apparently, these guys had also lived in that trailer for almost 15 years, and no one had any idea they were up to this. You're probably wondering how they went unnoticed, because if you live in a less desirable area like this trailer park, there's an untold saying not to rat out your neighbors, as it apparently just puts a big target on yourself. But fortunately, a new family had just moved into the trailer, right next door to these guys, and apparently they didn't get the memo. All 3 guys were arrested and sentenced to life in prison on multiple charges. The Asian woman was never caught because she wasn't there when the bust happened. One of the guys actually died in prison a month after he was arrested due to years of drug use. The trailer they found him in was demolished a week after the guys had been arrested. We have not been back to that town since and most likely never will. And you who are listening to this story, always be careful who you trust, as even the most seemingly nice and harmless people can be the monster's lure to lure its prey. Hi, my name is Valeria, and this happened when I was on a 2-week vacation with my best friends in Las Vegas. Betty and Jasmine, my best friends for my whole life. The 3 of us, we had always wanted to go to Las Vegas, so when we finally could afford it, we wasted no time booking flights and hotel. And although Betty was excited about the little bit of gambling we were planning to do, I couldn't wait to visit a supposedly abandoned ghost town that my dad used to tell me a lot of stories about. And although my friends were against it at first, I finally convinced them, so we rented a truck and drove to the ghost town. On the first day of our second week in Las Vegas, we made sure to arrive around 4:30 in the afternoon, so we could explore a bit while the sun was still out, but luckily, we didn't have to endure the intense heat for too long. But I have to admit, as soon as we arrived at my expected ghost town, I realized that it wasn't really what I expected. My father had made it sound like all the houses were still in good condition, and being here was like walking in a time capsule from when the town was abandoned in the 1950s. But that wasn't the case at all. This was like walking through a desolate desert with only dust and heat at every step. As we walked through the streets surrounded by buildings that were tagged with graffiti, most of them even had huge holes in the side of the houses that you could see through. And I could tell that Betty and Jasmine were getting uncomfortable as we walked down the street. They kept looking around as if they were worried that we were being followed. I try not to let it get to me, but it wasn't long before I was feeling nervous too, and for good reason. And that was because it was already getting dark, and this only made the feeling worse. I tried to keep my spirits up, reminding my girls that we had brought an amazing dinner to eat after we set up our camp. And as soon as I mentioned that it was as if all the tension had disappeared, my friends no longer focused on the potential horrors that could have surrounded us and instead focused on finding a good place for us to set up our camp. We were walking down the most central street in the ghost town, when suddenly Betty reminded us that there was a house that looked to be in relatively good condition a little further down that same road, so we all agreed to check to see if we could sleep there. But that's when our fears began to become reality. As we were walking towards the house we were going to sleep in, Jasmine grabbed Betty and I by the shoulder and in a very low voice said, "Girls, I don't think we are alone." Hearing this, I started to laugh, as she has always been the prankster of the group, and I thought this was just one of her twisted pranks. But then I turned my face and looked at her, and that's when I noticed that she was practically turned around looking behind us as we walked. I looked over my shoulder to where her eyes were pointing, and since there were no lights on in the street at the time, or maybe in years, it was almost impossible to make anything out. It was hard to see at first, but once they moved, there was no doubt that there was someone walking down the street behind us. I could barely make out their shadowy silhouette, but there was no doubt that they were walking towards us. Jasmine asked if maybe we should say something, but Betty and I agreed that we should keep walking. Maybe it was someone who, like us, had had the bright idea to come camping in a ghost town, and hopefully they would leave us alone quickly. But we were wrong, because as soon as we turned around and continued walking down the street, we all heard the sound of the person's shoes hitting the pavement fast and hard, as if they had started to run. I turned my head again, and this time all I could say was that we had to run right now, for as I looked over my shoulder, I could tell that the shadowy figure was now much closer to us and showed no signs of stopping. The three of us ran down the street for a while before deciding to turn onto one of the yards and then run through the houses in the hope of losing whoever was chasing us. We ran at full speed for a few yards before Betty said she couldn't run anymore, and we were all out of breath at that point, so we decided to run upstairs onto the back porch of one of the houses to see if the door was open, hoping we could hide inside. But it wasn't. When Jazz and Betty joined me on the porch, I was about to say the door was closed, when Jazz put her hands on Betty's shoulder and mine simultaneously and pushed us down so that we were all crouched down and very quietly. Yasmin told us not to speak and whispered that she was coming. I could hear the footsteps of the person chasing us running through the dry, dirt-covered yards. We all held our breath as he rounded the corner. At that moment, I thought it was all over, and that we had been caught by some kind of maniac. But fortunately, whoever this scary guy was, he must have thought we had kept running, because he didn't even turn around to check the porch. As the guy ran past, we waited a minute or two in complete silence just to make sure the person wasn't coming back. And once we were sure he was gone, we caught our breath, the three of us, and decided we needed to get out of there as soon as possible, so without waiting too long, we ran off the porch and back through the yards of the abandoned houses so that when we arrived, we went straight to the driveway where we parked the van we had rented and got into it as fast as we could before taking off and heading back to town. When we got to the hotel, I told my dad about our strange encounter, and he was very puzzled. He said nothing like that ever happened to him when he was younger, but then kindly reminded me that it was a long time ago. A couple of years ago, I moved to a quiet little town in Arizona. I had previously lived in a suburb a few miles away, but this place was a complete nightmare, as I had the worst neighbors you can have. These were a bunch of pubescent kids who partied every weekend and annoyed the whole neighborhood, and to top it off, they were always bringing undesirable people to our street. So after almost 3 years of torment, I decided to look for a quiet and secluded place to live. And this town was perfect. Besides, my neighbors were the best I could find. Polite, kind, but above all, quiet people. However, nothing can be perfect, as the saying goes. And soon my idyll of good neighborliness would be damaged by something even worse than a couple of partying neighbors. Toxic couple. I had been living in this town for a year, when my next-door neighbor told me in a casual conversation while watering the garden that she found a boyfriend and things were going well, and she told me that she would soon be moving in with her. I congratulated her on her new relationship and wished her well, but just a month later, things began to change drastically next door. Loud arguments could often be heard through the walls, and the dog reacted as badly as I did, the poor little guy barking like crazy, while my neighbor and the new love of her life yelled at each other repeatedly. I tried. I ignored the noise for a couple of weeks, but finally lost my mind and started banging on the wall. This seemed to surprise them, because for a few minutes they were silent, but only at first, because then they continued arguing and all the other blows I hit the wall were completely ignored. The arguments continued for more than 3 months, and after several visits from the police, my neighbor showed up at my door to apologize. He claimed that things were going well just as he had told me before. But after he moved in, his behavior changed radically. I just told her that I was very sorry, but that I had a right to have peace of mind too. She apologized and said it wouldn't happen again, but it did. Just a few days later, they had another horrible argument in which he even physically assaulted her. But before the police could find out, she had already forgiven him. That night, he swore it would never happen again. And I know because I could hear absolutely all the drama through our shared wall. The thing is, after promising not to assault her again, he did. And after another huge, loud fight, she kicked him out of the house. I couldn't have been happier for her and for me. Her hope was that he would move in with someone else. However, he soon showed up at her door out of nowhere, begging her to take him back, so she called the police and got a restraining order. It was almost a month ago, and I was hoping he was gone for good, and it seemed that way. From what I could see and hear, things were back to the way they were originally. I was back to living a peaceful life, and I assumed she was too. Considering we had opposite schedules, it wasn't unusual for us to go weeks without seeing or hearing from each other, and I was happy to keep it that way. But then something scary would happen. One day on my way home from work, I was about to go into my garage, but I was blocked by several police cars and an ambulance. It was a startling thing to see, but it was none of my business. I parked on the street and headed for my door, but as I approached, I noticed that my neighbor's was wide open, and police officers were coming in and out. After what she told me, I assumed that her ex had shown up uninvited back at her house. Another officer stopped me and informed me that the area was closed. I let him know I lived next door and asked what had happened. He said they couldn't tell me, but if I waited for a detective to come out, he would probably have some questions for me. The cop said something over the radio a minute later, and then a guy in a suit came out of the house and took me aside. He just had a few questions, asked me if I had seen anything, where I was during the day, if I knew of anyone my neighbor was having problems with, and other things. I answered everything he asked without hesitation, but as the seconds passed, I became more and more nervous and begged him to tell me what was going on. He paused and said in a very serious tone that my neighbor had been found dead in her apartment earlier that day. My eyes must have looked like saucers. I was completely shocked and wondered how I had missed something so important. But before the policeman could ask the question, I blurted out the answer without thinking. It was her ex. The cop's reaction to my answer made me realize that he was their prime suspect. The detective finally handed me his card and let me go. The next morning, I was browsing the local newspaper online and found a story about the murder. It explained that my neighbor was a week late in paying rent and received a notice, when no response came. After 2 days, the manager visited the apartment personally. There was no response even after he called her, so he went inside and found the house, which is how he found the body. The detective was quoted as saying that they still had not found her ex, and that they believed she had fled back to her original home in Lebanon. Not much information has come out since then. The ex-boyfriend is still unaccounted for, and there are no other suspects at this time.